be presenting my project on Ursula Le Guin's 9 Lives and the attributing socio-political subtext and context of the time. So on the subcontext that is or was popular racial politics, ideologies, and socio-cultural atmosphere from the 1850s to 1970s, wherein the book was published in 1968. I'm going to give some context as to why Le Guin wrote this particular tale the way she did, so the specific American perspectives that attributed to the world building of Libra, the significance of the clones and xenophobia within the story, as well as the significance of the racial characterizations of the John Chows, Guilin Martin, and Owen Pugh. So to recap, 9 Lives is a work of speculative fiction wherein a mass of 10 clones, the John Chows, are immigrated, so to say, to the planet of Libra to aid in the work of collecting uranium from the planet's deposits. The tale focuses initially on a perspective from the eyes of a white Owen Pugh and a black Guilin Martin who had found a working balance amongst themselves prior to the disruptive arrival of the Asian John Chows. The tale later shifts to the perspective of the sole surviving calf of the John Chow collective and how he deals with being an individual and alone for the first time in his life or existence. Their ideas of social Darwinism exchanged heavily in the novel, so how the greatest collective shapes what is ideal or normal within a civilization. And this can be seen within the self-ostracization of Martin and Pugh. But I don't quite think that Le Guin intended to further push these extremist ideals, which were the ideals of the time's history that I'll touch on here in a second. I think that Le Guin meant to interrogate those ideals of social Darwinism and the rationality or human morality of them, so to say. I think that Le Guin intended to delineate or else just bring into light the othered human as not other, but something still human, just of a different perspective due to difference in upbringing or natural culture or origin. Where this novelette was targeted towards an American society that of its time treated any culture or race that appeared different as the other and as non-human. Moreover, 9 Lives focuses on these ideas of xenophobic fears from a speculated perspective. So fears about immigration and emigration representing American socio-political circumstances of the time. Specifically, circumstances and fears about Asian immigration into Western and European cultures, creating what was known or is known as the Yellow Peril. So this idea of the Yellow Peril created a subgenre of sorts within speculative fiction known as Techno-Orientalism, and this idea extends into the cyborg character like the John Chows that's incapable of individualism and characterized as non-emotive, an indentured servant without free choice, free action, or free thought. So essentially an extreme psychologically communist identity, which is very non-Western and alien, so to say. A little about Le Guin's backstory. Her parents were both anthropologists and both interested in studying and documenting native and unknown cultures. So I think much of Le Guin's literary pursuits take after her parents' example in that they're more culturally focused, and she often focuses on topics centering around anthropological and cultural observations within her own society, and then her speculations of that. As well, it's been noted that Le Guin takes after some Taoist inspirations, wherein Taoism speaks about harmony, balance, and sort of oneness that all creatures are to strive for amongst themselves. So one of the major ideals of Taoism is the concept of yin and yang, which is essentially two opposing forces that find a foundation of balance between their disparities. This represents an idea that nothing makes sense by itself, as the existence of one thing is defined by contrasting existence of its other. So this is prominent especially when thinking about how Pugh and Martin identify themselves as the other in the presence of the John Chows for their cultural differences. And then how Calf is forced to identify himself amongst Martin and Pugh at the loss of his clones, which he never had to do before. So while these two tidbits are important factors within the theme of 9 Lives, just as relevant is the political context of the time that the story was written and or published during, and how this all ties together. So circling back, the Yellow Peril was a moment in the late 1960s that which denoted American and European fears about people immigrating from East Asia and seeing them as an existential danger to the Western world. Specifically for the Chinese people who had begun their immigration to the U.S. during the gold rush in 1848 to 1855, and then their continued immigration for the building of the transcontinental railroads starting in 1860 and growing until about 1869. As far as the timeline goes, for an exact history, in 1860, the Central Pacific Railroad director, Charles Crocker, had recommended hiring Chinese workers after a job ad resulted in only a few hundred responses from white workers. So January of 1864, they started with a crew of 21 Chinese workers that then became 50 and then 50 more and growing and growing. So while the demand for labor increased, white workers were still reluctant to do the hard and hazardous work that this job required. So more Chinese immigrants began arriving in California, and thus the Transcontinental Railroad was able to be completed by 1969 with a total of 20,000 Chinese workers at hand, and that made up 90% of the railroad construction crew in total. So before the railroad was completed in 1869, the Burlingame Treaty was enacted, and this allowed for the legal migration of workers from China and was ultimately inspired by the precedents of completing the Transcontinental Railroad. This act was not taken kindly by white Americans, as they claimed the Chinese were taking their jobs, only it was work that no white man was himself willing to do. The xenophobia of the Yellow Peril was essentially legalized in the U.S. with the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited the entry of Chinese women and marked the end of the U.S.'s open borders. Additionally, 7 years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. And finally, the Geary Act of 1892 extended the Chinese Exclusion Act and added new requirements like requiring people of Chinese descent to carry a certificate of residence, which was a precursor to the green card system. And this as well forced residents already living in the U.S. to either register for a certificate or be caught without documentation and be subject to detention or deportation. So the term Yellow Peril was actually retrospectively coined by Russian sociologist Jacques Novikov in 1897 within his essay Le Peril, the Yellow Peril. So the term Yellow Peril became more of a fear-mongering sentiment that China and Japan were in an alliance to conquer and subjugate the world. But in the West, the concept Yellow Peril was more blended with Western anxieties about the alien other and the loss of the West by the mass immigrations of Eastern people. So this Yellow Peril wasn't exactly a concern about nationality, but became more so a racial and racist concern, where the immigrating people from East Asia were categorized as a collective other and seen as indistinguishable from one another by the very fearful and xenophobic American eye. Ultimately, I think that the John Chows represent this mass immigration of the Chinese people, and their otherness is exemplified by Martin and Pugh and their reactions when they're threatened by this new and unfamiliar bulk presence of the John Chows. I think, too, that based on this historical context, the planet Libra could be seen as a metaphor for the United States and its aggressively expelling forces against the Chinese amidst the late 1890s, thus leaving only a few remaining people who were forced to assimilate to Western culture, as CAF was without his collective. As well, the overarching theme about the separation of family and a collective unit, and then the loss of cultural identity, heritage, and self as a result of that. I think this represents the white nationalist, ruthless, socio-Darwinistic competition within the U.S., and it's represented through the Darwinistic survival of the fittest plotline in 9 Lives. Ultimately, the John Chows are forgotten and just replaced by another 10 clone after their peril, and really treated as if they were just a commodity and not ever a people. We can see the psychological effect this has on Calf during his mourning, and I think this is ultimately representative of the work that the 20,000 Chinese laborers put in, left unappreciated, and the after effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act and Geary Act on the remaining Chinese people, the psychological effects of that. As well, the lack of sympathy and understanding from Martin and Pugh portrays the inhumane and diminutive attitude of the U.S. by its lack of sympathy and understanding for who they would consider the other. Overall, the historical context here is so important to understand the underlying subcontext and emotion of 9 Lives. The pain and loss it portrays is realistic, even if just metaphorical, as it's reflected through CAF, the true pain that these Chinese immigrants faced as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act and Geary Act, and all the efforts left unnoticed of their work on the Transcontinental Railroad. I'm hoping this historical context provided some greater insight and understanding about 9 Lives and its potentially historical intentions. I know my own personal perspective on the novel was changed after I began thinking about the novel from this historical metaphorical perspective, and also just from the overall historical context of the time.